Money Radio, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the review. Now it's time to talk real estate with Laura Bramnick from TalkRealEstateAZ.com. TalkRealEstateAZ.com. Laura is an attorney and a real estate agent and a consumer advocate. She represents people for residential, commercial, land transactions. Laura holds an active Arizona real estate license. She's been an investor over the years. She's a certified instructor with the Arizona Department of Real Estate and licensed through the State Bar of Arizona, specializing in real estate. For more information, TalkRealEstateAZ.com is the website. And there are even some videos there of you and me talking together.
There are.
And everything I ever learned about real estate, I think I learned from our conversations.
Oh, that's great, Sinclair. I hope the listeners did too.
I hope so. You provide a lot of great information. And last week we were talking about landlord-tenant issues, security deposits.
Correct.
But there's a lot more to being a landlord and a tenant. One important area that I think a lot of folks don't really understand is landlord access to a property once it has been rented.
Yes.
And this is very important. That's one way somebody can make some big mistakes.
Yeah, you know, it's very difficult to kind of wrap your arms around the concept that I own a property that I can't enter if there's a tenant in it without the tenant's permission.
Right.
And that is in fact the law. You have to give 48 hours notice, and the tenant under the law cannot withhold their consent unreasonably. But if the tenant does withhold consent, you can't just take your key and open the door.
Okay.
And you can't go there when you know the tenant's not home. You know, because the tenant is entitled to have their quiet, what they call their quiet enjoyment of the property.
A little bit of privacy.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So what do? Well, first of all, the lease says that the landlord has to give the notice. And in the case of an emergency, if let's say there's maybe the tenant's not home and a neighbor maybe calls and says
There's smoke or there's
right,
water
exactly.
flowing out the door.
Yeah, exactly right. The landlord can enter to take care of the emergency.
Okay.
That's number one. And number two, if the tenant will not grant access and the lease provides it, the landlord can terminate the lease and evict the tenant if they won't voluntarily leave.
So that's something the tenant needs to be very much aware of.
Yeah, and that sounds like a lot, but the alternative is that the landlord would have to file a lawsuit and get an injunction, which is a lot more work and a lot more expensive. So the court would have to order the tenant to leave, and if the tenant didn't leave under the injunction, they could be escorted out by law enforcement.
Now, there are some very good reasons why a landlord might need access to an apartment. Real estate regularly needs some repair or maintenance.
The other thing is that you have a right to inspect your property. You know, there may be, let's say, a roof leak.
Yeah.
Maybe the tenant, you have an acrimonious relationship with the tenant and they didn't bother to tell you. You really need to get in there to prevent mold.
Sure.
You know, that's major damage to the property. You know, maybe there's a tree root growing.
Whether the tenant has called in a repair request or not.
Right, and so there are a lot of things that, maybe there's termites.
Yeah.
You know, maybe a tenant just has decided to ignore it. Maybe a tenant doesn't even know what termites look like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of people from out of Arizona haven't seen termites. And so you may want to go and inspect, because those are the type of things that can cause long-term damage that you can fix early and prevent major damage.
So the tenant has to give reasonable access for maintenance and repair, but again, the landlord still has to make a formal request.
Yes, the landlord has to make a formal request.
Can't just show up and say, I'm inspecting for maintenance or repair purposes.
And I do get a lot of calls from tenants who say my landlord just shows up and they do not realize that they don't have to let him in. And they feel kind of violated, you know, because they're in the middle of something, or maybe the house is messy And,
Yeah.
you know, there's lots of reasons that people want to be private.
Well, what about also when a property is possibly being sold or renting to a new tenant and they need to show the property?
Yeah, well, that, under the statute, is reasonable access. That's a reasonable, it's reasonable for the landlord to request access for that purpose.
Okay.
And that's why the 48 hours notice. I have some tenants that request 72 hours, which is fine. And normally, when you're listing the property for rent or sale on the MLS, it says that right in the public remarks, so you know who to call or who to email to get access. And it's a big problem when the tenant doesn't grant access, because maybe the tenant's leaving in a month, and you don't really want the property vacant for a month.
Right.
And you may be able to rent it pretty much right after the tenant moves out. And so that can cause you some damages. So if the tenant won't grant you reasonable access, you want to be on top of that. And if you have to go to court to exert your rights, you want to do that.
And if there are damages as a result of not granting reasonable access, can the landlord sue over something like that?
Yes, the landlord can sue for access, they can sue for damages, they can always sue for damages. And especially if the tenant was negligent. Unless it was normal wear and tear, the landlord is entitled to get their damages. There's also a statute that specifically says that the landlord may not forcibly take possession, may not forcibly remove the tenant, may not diminish or interrupt services, meaning may not cut off water,
Right.
or heat or air conditioning, except if the tenant has abandoned the property. So
If they're in there,
if you're going to become a landlord, you want to really become familiar with the Landlord-Tenant Act, and the Justice Court has fill-in-the-blank forms, so they make it easy if you need to go to court. My recommendation is consult a lawyer, but once you understand the process, you may not have to hire a lawyer every time.
okay. And you can help.
Yeah, definitely, yeah,
You've represented landlords, you've represented tenants.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the most important thing is to get the lease done right.
And make sure that all the documentation is there, keep track of everything.
And that's why I like the Arizona Association of Realtors form rather than a form off the internet.
Very good.
It's important to have an expert help you draft it.
And as always, an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. And that's what you can provide, is that ounce of prevention, so
Right.
that there are not problems down the road.
Exactly.
Laura Bramnick, talkrealestateaz.com. That's the website, talkrealestateaz.com. The phone number, 480-624-2705, 480-624-2705, and Laura does answer her own phone. The website, talkrealestateaz.com. Great info. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Sinclair.